Okay, so I've got up to my 30th Prime Minister, well over halfway now, William Ewart Gladstone. As with Disraeli, it's very likely there'll be pieces of information that'll inadvertently miss out on this, so do excuse me for that, but I've put links, as I do with all these Prime Ministerial videos below. Um, William Gladstone, of all the Prime Ministers I've named so far, he's probably the highest ranking in scholarly circles. Um, so much to say about this man. I'm just going to start basically with some basic biography. That seems like the best way to go. He was born in 1809 in Liverpool, of Scottish descent. And an interesting thing about the young Gladstone, and this may surprise some people, although he's known as a great liberal statesman, he was actually a pretty right-wing Tory. He opposed, for example, women's suffrage and other what would have been at that time radical politics. He was also, his father was actually a slave owner, or at least had made his, slave owner is the wrong word, but had made his money, his fortune from slavery. The Gladstones were pretty well off. Um, this is a quote on the 10 Downing Street page about Gladstone. The love of freedom itself is hardly stronger in England than the love of aristocracy. Queen Victoria described him as a half-mad firebrand, while to a large part of the British working classes he was a grand old man. 4 times Prime Minister, Gladstone provoked strong reactions. Now, that famous rivalry with Disraeli, um, I sometimes wonder if the title Grand Old Man came after Disraeli's death, because Disraeli was 5 years older than Gladstone, which is something that really that surprised me when I first found out about it. Um, but they were bitter rivals. Um, Gladstone was Chancellor, very highly esteemed Chancellor on many occasions, no fewer than 4 occasions, from 1852 to 55, 1859 to 66, 1873 to 1874, and 1880 to 1882. I believe that makes him one of Britain's longest serving chancellors. Um, he was Secretary of State for War in the Colonies from 1845 to 1846. I assume that would have been under the Russell administration, President of the Board of Trade. Um, and leader of the opposition on 3 occasions, as well as being Lord Privy Seal on 2 occasions. So Gladstone was a very highly ranked minister in a highly ranked parliamentarian all round. He was Prime Minister on a record 4 occasions, 1868 to 1874, 1880 to 1885, a brief period in 1886, and finally 1892 to 1894. When he finally left office in 1894, he was 82 years old. Just do the math there. Born in 1809, 9 from 80. Actually, when he left office finally, he was 85 years old. That makes him the oldest man to ever leave Downing Street. A few more pieces of information from the Downing Street website itself. He was first elected as a Tory MP, and he was a High Tory for Newark in December 1832 at the age of 23, and he had ultra-conservative views. This is an incredible thing. In Parliament, he spoke out against the abolition of slavery because his family used slaves on the West Indian plantation. He also opposed the recent democratic electoral reforms. So this is quite shocking, in all honesty. Gladstone's talent for public speaking caught the attention of Robert Peel, then Prime Minister, who made him a junior Lord of the Treasury and later Under Secretary of the Colonial Office. He followed Peel in resigning in 1835 and spent the following 6 years in opposition. In 1840, Gladstone began his rescue and rehabilitation of London prostitutes. Even while serving as Prime Minister in later years, he would walk the streets trying to convince them to change their ways, these ladies of the night. He spent a large amount of his own money on this work. Now, by the standards of the time, this would have been seen as great philanthropy. By today's standards, certainly a lot of eyebrows are raised about this. Um, for an elder statesman to be doing this. Given the religiosity of Gladstone, many people would have taken it at face value. That is, he probably had good intentions, he was trying to save them, etc. But by today's standards, for a middle-aged, privileged statesman to be sort of conversing with sex workers late at night, you can imagine the outcry the tabloids would have today over something like this. So that's something that is definitely an interesting side note. Um, like Churchill, Gladstone's associated with many famous speeches, um, but I'll come to that soon. In 1845, he resigned over Peel's decision to make a grant to a Roman Catholic theology school in Ireland. This caused some confusion as he was known to favour the policy himself. He rejoined Peel's government later that year as colonial secretary. When the Tory party broke in 1846, Gladstone followed Peel in becoming a liberal conservative, now believing strongly in free trade. In 1847, he returned to Parliament as MP for Oxford University. That's right. Both Oxford and Cambridge had their own constituencies at that point, having lost his New York seat. In 1858, he turned down a position in the Earl of Derby's Conservative government because he no longer believed in protectionism and did not want to work with Disraeli. Instead, he became Chancellor of the Exchequer in Aberdeen's coalition of Whigs, Peelites and Radicals in 1863, where he proved himself to be an outstanding minister. He was Chancellor again under Palmerston between 1859 and 1865, though the relationship was an uncomfortable one, and yet again under Russell from 1865 to 1866. During these years, he became persuaded of the case for a wider franchise, saying, "Every man who is not presumably incapacitated by some consideration of personal unfitness or of political danger is morally entitled to come within the pale of the Constitution." This is a very bureaucratic way to talk about a wider franchise, but you have to understand that politics at the time was very, very different. Um, and it looks like this is the time Gladstone was starting to get much more liberal. In 1867, Gladstone became leader of the Liberal Party following Palmerston's resignation and became Prime Minister for the first time the following year. His policies were intended to improve individual liberty while loosening political and economic restraints. Ireland was another area of Gladstone's concern, and he is often associated with Irish Home Rule. He successfully passed an act to disestablish the Church of Ireland and an Irish Land Act to tackle unfair landlords, but was defeated on an Irish University bill proposing a new university in Dublin open to Catholics and Protestants. However, in 1874, a heavy defeat in the general election led to his arch-rival Disraeli becoming Prime Minister. Gladstone retired as leader of the Liberal Party, but remained an intimidating opponent, attacking the government fiercely over the weak response to Turkish brutality in the Balkans known as the Eastern Crisis. In 1880, he became Prime Minister for a second time, much against Queen Victoria's will. Her dislike of him, like I mentioned earlier, led her to complain that he dresses me as though I were a public meeting. For 2 years, he combined the offices of Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is something very few other leaders have done. There have been other Prime Ministers who were Chancellor, such as John Major, Jim Callaghan. I think Churchill had been Chancellor, but very few others had balanced the roles as widely as Gladstone did. Trouble overseas created major problems. He failed to rescue General Gordon from Khartoum, that's the famous Gordon of Khartoum, during the Anglo-Maratha Wars, leading to the loss of British control in Sudan, and a dent in Gladstone's popularity. Critics reverse his GOM nickname for Grand Old Man to MOG, Murderer of Gordon. In 1885, the government's budget was defeated, prompting him to resign, with Lord Salisbury becoming Prime Minister. Gladstone declined an earldom offered by Queen Victoria, preferring to remain in office. In February 1886, at the age of 76, he became Prime Minister for a third time. Working in alliance with Irish nationalists, he immediately introduced the Irish Home Rule Bill, proposing a Parliament for Ireland. It was defeated and he lost the general election held in July 1886. Gladstone devoted the next 6 years to convincing the British electorate to grant Home Rule to Ireland. Campaigning on the issue, the Liberals won the 1892 election and he returned for a fourth administration. He once more introduced the Irish Home Rule Bill, but was rejected by the Lords. He resigned in March 1894, having failed to retain the support of his cabinet. William Ewart Gladstone died on the 19th of May 1898 at his home in Hawarden from cancer, and he's buried in Westminster Abbey. Um, Just checking if Gladstone got a state funeral. Checking the Wikipedia article here. A few photographs available of Gladstone. He died at his home at Hawarden in Wales, at his family estate there. Um, I don't know if he got a state funeral. I'm trying to find information about that. But he is designated a grave in Westminster Abbey, which really is quite a prestigious venue. It's like Arlington in the United States. Um, One thing the Downing Street website doesn't mention is his famous speaking tours. He was a very energetic campaigner, um, especially during the famous Midlothian campaign, and he's well known for addressing huge crowds across the country. Um, I think we can make some comparisons of some other world leaders in that regard. He was 88 when he died, which is a very good run for a Victorian man. The House of Commons adjourned on the afternoon after Gladstone's death, with Arthur Balfour giving notice for an address to the Queen, praying for a public funeral and public memorial in Westminster Abbey. Um, Parliament approved the address, and Herbert Gladstone accepted the public funeral. So that was a state funeral on behalf of the Gladstone family. His coffin was transported in the London Underground before his state funeral, which the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, and Duke of York, the future George V, acted as pallbearers. That's incredible when you think about it, to have two future kings act as pallbearers to a subject. That's the esteem that Gladstone was held. Um, he is, needless to say, remembered in a lot of media. He's been in numerous films. In the recent adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, the pet bulldog is nicknamed Gladstone. Um, and he is remembered by countless statues and plaques. Um, there's statues in Liverpool, in London, in Manchester, in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, um, all over the country, all over the United Kingdom. Gladstone, Oregon, Gladstone, New Jersey, Gladstone, Michigan, Gladstone, New Mexico are all named in his honor. Gladstone, Queensland, and Gladstone, Manitoba. Um, So this really does show something of Gladstone's prestige in the 19th century. I think it's fair to say was one of the towering political figures of the 19th century. I think if he surpasses Disraeli, it's only because he outlived Disraeli, because we can't underestimate the weight that Disraeli had either. They'll forever be associated with each other. Um, some important acts during his time: the Representation of the People Act 1884, which increased the number of men eligible to vote. Um, the introduction of secret polling, the Government of Ireland Bill in 1886 and 1893, um, and he served as Prime Minister for more than any other man, 4 years. But actually, contrary to popular belief, he wasn't the longest serving Victorian Prime Minister. That's Lord Salisbury. But as I'll come to in the Salisbury video, Salisbury, although he outranked both Gladstone and Disraeli in tenure overall, he was a much more distant figure, and apart from within the Tory party, isn't really given the same weight as Gladstone or Disraeli. Um, so that's William Ewart Gladstone. Um, Trying to think of some things to add to that. All the pictures of Gladstone, except maybe some in his early years, shows a very, very solemn looking man. There's even a street in Bulgaria named in honor of William Gladstone. I guess that's in honor of the fact he spoke out against Bulgarian atrocities, or atrocities in Bulgaria, I should say. I guess that's comparable actually to Tony Blair being widely hailed in Kosovo. And I make no apologies for making that comparison because it just reminds me of it. Kosovo was, sorry, Tony Blair is venerated in Kosovo, or at least venerated might be a strong word, but he's widely respected in Kosovo for his interventionist policies there. Gladstone made efforts to try and push Disraeli on acting against the atrocities in Bulgaria. So I think that's a valid comparison. Midlothian campaign of 1879 to 1880 was an early example of many modern political campaigning techniques. So that documentary with Hugh Edwards when he talks about early presidential style politics. He may be referring to that. I'm really trying to find if there's anything I'm missing here because there's so much to be said about Gladstone. Like I say, if you look at the picture of him on Wikipedia, it's almost scary. It shows a very, very solemn old man. But Gladstone is a towering figure. He's consistently ranked as one of our top prime ministers. If not, if he isn't quite on level with Churchill, he almost always ranks in either second, third, or fourth position. So we can't underestimate the influence that William Gladstone had. And we use the adjective Gladstonian. So I'll leave it there, but inevitably there'll be something that I haven't mentioned there. So I'm just being wary about that. As Chancellor, Gladstone made a speech in Newcastle in 1862 in which he supported the independence of the Confederate States of America, claiming that Jefferson Davis had made a nation. He did not consider slavery a problem. Um, However, it should be mentioned that he later regretted the Newcastle speech. Um, so Gladstone is one of political metamorphosis of changing from a hardline conservative with some very, very politically incorrect views by today's standards um, to being a liberal icon. So this is quite incredible. He did have a long life, 88, which is very old age for a Victorian man. And I'll leave it there. That's William Ewart Gladstone.